5, 4,
3,
2,
1.
but who's counting, right? And his name is Major.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen,
please welcome Major Garrett.
From the nation's capital.
Major, fantastic.
It's The Takeout.
This is a major achievement.
With CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent,
Major Garrett, yes, CBS, yes, hi.
Major Garrett.
Major, that's nonsense, and you should know better.
Is Major out of the doghouse?
The answer is yes.
Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. I'm Major Garrett. This is The Takeout. Let me just say this. I've been here before, but never like this. Where am I? I'm at a place called the Tune-In. We've never brought the show here before. We'll probably come back. This is a favorite sort of burger joint in D.C. You might call it fairly a dive bar. I wouldn't, but some might. I spent a lot of time here in the early 90s when I was first launching my career in journalism in Washington, so I've been here many times, just haven't brought the show here before. So what are we talking about this week? Well, if you're a fan of this show, and I know you are, you know the name Luke Russert, you know the name Tim Russert. Neither need any amplification, and superlatives to one apply to the other. Tim Russert is a legend. Luke Russert is a lesser legend, but still a legend nevertheless. And Luke has written a book. We'll put the graphic up. Look for me there. The subtitle, Grieving My Father, Finding Myself. Luke Russert, great to have you with us.
Thank you so much. I think I saw your ghost running around there in the back there, Major.
I have many ghosts that run around Washington,
The 90s at the Tune-In,
exactly.
Washington, D.C. What a time.
DC.
What
It
a
was
time.
It was a time. Folks, this is a book about Luke's travels after quitting the TV business. Almost 3 years, 60 countries. It reads like a travelogue, most of it, but I'm going to go back to front because the latter part of the book is much grittier and much more honest than the front part of the book. We'll ask Luke why that is, but I want to read something to you just so people get a feel for what you were struggling with while you were on this journey. I want to read to you from page 205. I can't compare. I make no impact. I do no good. I can't come close to him. Can't even bring myself to try. Pathetic. Why'd you write that?
So, I think one of the things you struggle with in the grieving process, but especially when you've lost somebody that is seemingly larger than life, that is first and foremost your dad and your best friend, but there's an element of his public-facing forward self, was this idea of inadequacy. And it can manifest itself in so many different ways, which is, oh, my father did so much more with so much less than I did, I'm inadequate. My father at this age did so much more, I'm inadequate. My mother had done so much more at this age, I'm inadequate. Why can't I figure things out? Why can't I put things together? I've been given all this privilege, all this opportunity, but I'm seemingly letting everything slip through the grasp of my hand. And you're referencing a chapter that I talk about called Boxes. And it's essentially towards the end, a middle part of 2018. And it follows a period where I had a difficult conversation with my mother, where she basically asked me, you've been out of media over a year and a half. What are you doing with your life? You need to figure this out. It was all great to have your eat, pray, love moment, but, follow it up, do something. And so
that did not land all that well.
It didn't. I was a little upset about it.
You were pissed off.
I was, as I think folks as sons that have domineering mothers can relate to. But what I did is I went up to the attic, and there were these boxes. And they had sat there for 10 years, and I had never actually gone through them because going through them meant two things. As one, I would actually have to admit Dad was completely gone because I was processing the death. But secondly, I was uncomfortable knowing what would pop out. And sure enough, as I go through this long, tedious process, every time I see letters he wrote, I see his handwriting, I see little notes in the margins, I find my old report cards, and he had written in there, "Good job, buddy." But then I see this box about his political career. So before he was ever with NBC News, he was a staffer right down the hill, right down the street on the Hill, for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, chief of staff. And then he worked for Governor Cuomo in New York. And in that box, there's how Tim Russert led Moynihan's re-election in 1982. Moynihan won by 1 million votes. It's the largest landslide ever. He did that at age 32. He led that landslide. Then he goes and works for Cuomo for a few years. ends up becoming a senior VP at NBC at 34 years old. So I'm at the same age reading this, unemployed, sort of trying to figure out my own way. And I look at, my God, what status he had risen to at such a young age, and instantly begin to compare myself, which is something I never tried to do when I was actually working in media, because I knew that would be a fallacy. You can't compare yourself to a Hall of Famer when you're starting out. That is silly. And when I did that, I really felt the weight of the inadequacy. And then that weight, I think, opened up a Pandora's box of every insecurity that I had had over the last few years just sort of came out in that moment.
I mentioned that the book gets grittier the longer you are in it. And I want to read something that reads to me as very truthful and also very gritty. This is from page 229.
Thank you.
This is near the end of all of your travels. Not the absolute end, but near the end. I think you'll recognize this. God, I look like I don't even look like me anymore. This isn't what this journey was supposed to be about. This is a pathetic and shameful bastardization. This isn't self-growth, and it's far, far away from self-care.
Yeah.
What the hell is this? So it feels like you were at this point where you thought there would be something larger, something more revealed to you, and you were still, after all this time, not only looking worse, feeling worse, but still searching.
So it's remarkable. You're looking for that aha moment, but the aha moment never fully shows itself. And so you're led to believe it's just around the corner. It's going to happen next. If I can just wait, it'll be there. And the very thing that I had sought out, this very thing that was saving me when I had left media, and this freedom that allowed me to become comfortable in uncertainty, this freedom that allowed me to get to know myself, to understand who I was independent of my parents in my hometown, this freedom that had allowed me to experience all these different cultures and get to know the ways of the world, is now kind of strangling me. This freedom that is supposed to be the good thing ends up becoming a bad thing because I had become untethered. So what you're referencing is that after a difficult evening in Abilene, Texas, where I had recently gone to Los Angeles. My mother had won all these Emmy Awards because there was a show made out of a book she wrote. The show was called The Assassination of Gianni Versace, American Crime Story. And we had gone to Tucson to visit some friends, and I just decided for the hell of it, I'm going to drive to Marfa, Texas, and see what the world finds. And I go through a lot of difficult moments on that journey. This woman who I've been seeing just basically says, get out, you're done, you're so untethered, you're so out there, I don't have time for you anymore. And I start to process all these things regarding the journey, which is, was this really worth it? What have I learned here? And that's the bottoming out, which you wrote, which is after a night of, drinking and overeating and just gorging. And when I wrote those, when I felt those emotions, I realized I had to make a switch. And that's actually when I went back and started to read the journals. And there were journals that I had kept throughout the entire traveling process. And it was in those journals and studying them that I realized, okay, I'm able to pinpoint where I was during certain moments of this journey. But there's also something in here, which I'm going to learn through reading these and I'm going to learn through writing them out. And what I ultimately come to figure out is that I was doing two things. And I was looking for something, which was being my own person and the acceptance of that from my father. Is it okay, Dad? Can I ask permission to be myself? And secondly, I was trying to outrun something. And that was grief, and actually sitting in those feelings, not storing and ignoring them, and processing them. And that is something that I had run away from for about 10 years. Because if I ever did that, he was truly gone and made me really uncomfortable, because then there was a lot of questions about, who are you?
Before you got to this space of wasting,
Yeah.
did you know there was a book?
No. My mom had always said to me, you have to do something with this journey. And I had taken all these photographs, and I had a pretty good Instagram going. And so in my own mind, I said, well, if worst comes to worst, I guess I could do like a travel blog, coffee table book or something, or self-publish, sell it on Etsy, I don't know.
I'm going to stop you with that thought there. The travel blog, coffee table book, it's much deeper what you rendered much, much deeper. We're going to get into that more in segment 2 of the Takeout. We're at the Tune-In. Lunch has arrived. Luke Russert is our special guest. Back in a second.
I would have conversations with people where they would say, well, who is the real you? And sometimes I wasn't aware of that.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back to the Takeout. We are coming to you from the Tune-In, place we have never been before, but we may return to again if they're willing and able. Certainly the food is good enough. Luke Russert is our special guest. So you didn't write a coffee table book. You didn't do an Instagram light blog. But still, I feel like you held back a little bit. Did you?
Ooh, it's a good question. It's like one of those Barbara Walters questions. I like that a lot. So when you write a memoir, it's personal. And the director, the guy who won the Academy Award, the Korean gentleman for that film a few years ago, Mr. Moon, he said something that the most personal is the most creative. Mm-hmm. And I tend to agree with that. But I think you have a balancing act. And what I mean by that is that you want to avoid the pitfall of this navel-gazing, sort of just looking inward all the time and having this stream of consciousness that a lot of people look at as like, oh my gosh, man, you know, go play some Bob Seger and smoke a joint out in the hills or something, right?
Get over yourself.
Yeah, get over yourself. Who cares? Then the other component of it is, if you want to air all the dirty laundry that's ever happened in your life, like, is that something that you feel is actually, in fact, honest, or is it just sort of
your memory of it?
Yeah, your memory of it.
And you're glossed
up.
So
for me, I did
it.
a sort of, I think, middle route there, which was I sort of spoke my piece, admitted with real honesty difficulty in my relationship with my mother, my own failings, but. You know, I think we all hold back in some capacity, but I put a pretty honest representation of who I am out there, as much as I was comfortable with at the time. I mean, I think I look back at Katie Couric's book, and you look at other books where they're sort of written towards further along in the back nine.
Yep.
Yeah. Would I ever say that coming back down the line, I'd say, hey, I'm going to get it all off my chest? But no, I mean, I still have, there's no like dark thing there. I some tons of admiration for NBC and admiration for the media world in general.
Are you better off without TV in your life?
Yeah, I think so. Because one of the grinds of television is there is an element of you that has to stay in character, which is not easy. And my father was great at very much being the same person who he was on television off camera, and understood the value added in that. And I could do the same thing, but it would weigh on me in ways that I didn't know. And I would have conversations with people where they would say, well, who is the real you? And sometimes I wasn't aware of that because the two conflict with each other so much. And I would always try and hang out with high school friends and do things that remove me sort of from the bubble of Washington. So I don't miss the TV world that much. There are moments where I wish I could be involved. For example, we're a few blocks away. January 6th is the story I regret I missed out on because I would have been in that building. I know the building like the back of my hand. I just walked by it. I actually have not been inside in 6 years now, but I could almost 7 years now. But I can tell you could drop me off anywhere in that complex, and I could get from point A to point B blindfolded.
Where were you on January 6th?
I was at home in Washington watching it on TV, and I had I felt guilt. I felt guilt not being there because I thought that could have been of service, just in terms of the coverage, and I was angry. And it was very upsetting to see that because that's a building that, to me,
it's the most beautiful building in America.
It's the most beautiful building in America.
In my
it's a personification of American values and American
it's where America comes to argue
and American democracy.
Yeah,
and it's a sort of civility. And, of course, there's a long family history there. My mom had interned on the Hill when she was younger. My dad worked there. So it was always a sort of a stately sort of home in my heart, in my head. So there is a sense of feeling violated.
Speaking of your mom, as you just did, yes, the subtitle is Grieving My Father, but I would also say part of this book is discovering your mother.
Yeah. I think what's interesting is at some point we start to understand who our parents are as mortals, and aside from the role of mom or the role of dad. And it was through this journey that I finally got to see who my mom was and what her origin story was. And, my entire life she'd encouraged me to travel. But I had never took her...
What was the caricature you had of your mom?
Domineering. Someone who had an incredible value system, but it was like a fiery Jesuit priest. And...
Bad cop.
Yeah. Bad cop compared to my dad's good cop. But a sort of when I bring up the Jesuit priest example, because one of the things that Jesuit priests do, and I love my Jesuit priests, but there's this expectation of, why can't you do more? Are you doing enough? And my mom very much personified that when I was growing up. And I write about, if it was a B+, why wasn't it an A-? If it was an A-, why wasn't it an A? You made the basketball team, that's not good enough. You should be starting. I mean, there's always a sort of do more, do more, do more. And it wasn't until I traveled and I realized that as a young woman, she graduated from college. The jobs available to her were to be a nurse or a teacher. She wanted to do something else. She wanted to do something more adventurous. And the only thing she really could do was join the Peace Corps at the time to get out from underneath her father or the patriarchy, whatever you want to call it. So she joined the Peace Corps as a young woman in the 60s and ended up building schools right outside of Medellin, Colombia, very rural, macho places. And took no BS. And I didn't realize the magnitude of that until I traveled with her one-on-one. I was in my early 30s the first time we ever did a overnight trip somewhere else together. I'd gone to spring training games with my father, political conventions with my dad growing up, tons of those trips. First time with my mom in my 30s. And I see her in these foreign countries, fearless, determined, very much ingratiating herself in the culture, having the ability to talk to anybody. And I realize, oh gosh, this is where that comes from. And I go, this is really who she is, which is that you can't settle. You got to be moving. You got to be, working towards something, and you got to be curious and inquisitive. And it's a relentless motor, and it's a relentless tank. But once I understood it, I got to understand her better, and our relationship got much stronger.
Was that one of the first times, if possibly the first time, you began to see yourself in her?
Yes. And what ended up happening there was I'd so closely identified with my father, but as I traveled and I saw the value in it, my dad was not he was not a real traveler. He was very risk adverse, very American in that sense. Grew up in a very parochial Irish Catholic neighborhood in South Buffalo, and really saw a value in the civil service lifestyle, which my grandfather worked 40 years, two
but
jobs
kind of
as a garbage. Yeah, but as a garbage man and a truck driver. But it was security was valued above all else. Is that you have a stable job. That stable job allows you a home, a beautiful family. Don't mess around outside of that comfort zone, because once you do, you're going to bring in bad things. And my dad very much believed that. He signed a 12-year contract when he was in NBC. A 12-year contract, which is unheard of. Which people say, why would you do that? You're limiting your ability to negotiate. I'm comfortable. I like where I am. I don't want to mess with it. And when I traveled with my mom and I saw that, wait, there is real value in being comfortable in uncertainty and taking on risk and putting yourself out there in situations that you might not be able to control. Because you learn so much, not about just yourself, but about others, I gravitated towards that. And I saw a real comfort in that for me.
Was that the first time in your life you were genuinely improvisational, traveling?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, you like to think when you go out on these reporting trips or whatever that you have moments where you peel away from the beaten path and you have there. But for me,
you're still pretty tethered.
Yeah, you're still pretty tethered. I think for me that, and I write this in the prologue, I'm driving around in rural Maine 3 weeks before the election in 2016, and that's the first time I really feel free in my entire life. And I say that because I was an only child, and while I had a wonderful upbringing in childhood and tons of opportunity, from a very young age, I was sort of taught to play up and perform, look people in the eye, shake their hands, talk to them, always be on cue. Mom and dad are saying something, talk to the adult, boom, boom, boom. And the time that I had alone was always time that I felt free, but it was in the context of my own bedroom, right? So then when I had that aloneness, but out into the actual world where I wasn't due back for a live shot, or I didn't have to file a story, or vacation was not ending. I started to explore these thoughts and feelings in my head way more than I had ever done before. And part of it I write in the book is I go back to that space of like the only child alone, being done with the responsibilities of the day, and it felt good.
More on the responsibilities of the day, aloneness, traveling, and the like with Luke Russert. When we come back, I'm Major Garrett at the Tune In, segment 3, coming up in just a minute. So I'm going to suggest you put your earphones on.
All right.
That
oh
right
my
now.
gosh! What a surprise!
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
I assure you, no hairspray or makeup is involved in the taping of this episode. Luke Russert is our special guest. You know, it's not every day that you're a reporter on Capitol Hill. Speaker of the House of Representatives calls you into his office and gives you life-transforming advice. That's what happened to Luke Russert. John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, did it. Briefly tell that story.
2015, springtime, and I was about to turn 30 in a few months, and back then I thought 30 was old. I realize now it is not.
As a 60-year-old, I can tell you it's not.
It is not. But the light at the end of the tunnel was seemingly getting closer. And I lost my father at 58. I lost a good friend at 27. So I started to sort of think, man, is there something else here? And I was feeling anxiety about the position. This job that had once brought me great joy, that I love covering, now started to feel almost stifling in a way. And I did not know if this is what I wanted to dedicate my life to. I felt that perhaps there was something else out there. But I was afraid to explore it, because to explore it felt to some degree like renouncing my last name, renouncing my position and whatnot. And John Boehner, who I covered rather aggressively, stops me and goes, "I want to talk to you." And I thought he was mad about coverage. So I was like, okay. So we step into his office, and I'm expecting to get dressed down, as often happens from politicians if they don't like something. And he goes, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Excuse me, sir, you invited me into your office. What do you mean, what am I doing here?" He goes, "No, what are you doing
You're
here?"
like, dummy. No, what are
Right.
you doing?
And he said, "Now, what are you doing here in Washington?" He goes, "You've been here now about 7, 8 years. He goes, "I've been here 20. I can tell you time is a flat surface. You can be here 30, 40, 50, 60 years and have no idea what happened. And there's always going to be another election. There's always going to be legislation. There's always going to be banquets. There's always going to be new people to see, people to meet, things to do. You can fall into it, and it can get lazy in a way. And you really should go out and see the world and challenge yourself to do something else, and just sort of understand that maybe there's something else out there and you might want to tap into it, and make sure that if this is in fact what you want to do, that you won't have any regret if you dedicate your life to
So I'm going to suggest you put your earphones on.
All right.
Because there's someone who can talk to us about that right now.
Oh my gosh.
Mr.
What a surprise. How
Mr.
are you,
Speaker.
sir?
Mr. Speaker.
Hi, boys.
How you doing?
I'm doing just great.
Thanks for. Should we ask you about the debt limit right now? I mean, how are the negotiations
we'll
go?
leave that. We'll leave that for a little bit. We'll leave that for a moment now. Mr. Speaker, talk to Luke Russert about that conversation as you remember it and what you were trying to convey.
Well, listen, my wife and I had 2 daughters, and over the years, I've adopted a lot of sons, members of Congress, staff, and even a couple of journalists. And, I've watched Luke over his 8 years on Capitol Hill, and, he's doing a good job, but it was like he was just going through the motions. It was easy for him. And I always thought Luke was a good guy, and one day I decided I need to have a conversation with this guy and talk to him about it's time to grow up. So I did.
And it was deeply impactful and deeply meaningful. And part of the reason why it resonated with me is that guy, John Boehner, had a very similar upbringing to my father. Large Catholic family. He's from Cincinnati. My dad's from Buffalo. But it was in some ways a validation, because here is a guy who understood, what real work was. Boehner worked as a janitor to pay his way through college. My dad worked as a cab driver, worked as a short order cook, worked in the rectory. So here is somebody who was coming at it from a place of, I'm being honest with you, there's another world out there that's worth exploring.
And Mr. Speaker, when you were talking about life on Capitol Hill and time as a flat surface, is there a kind of treadmill in Washington that people can lose track of?
Well, yeah, some people just spend their whole lives there, their whole career there. I always thought it was a stop along my journey of life and my career. I was never going to be one of those old guys walking around Capitol Hill who didn't quite know who he was or where he was. And I don't want Luke to be that guy either.
So let me ask you this, Mr. Speaker. Why didn't you ever tell me that?
Well, what? So Luke, just because you don't know, but I've known Major for over 30 years.
I can imagine.
I could have given him this advice a long time ago, but he got married and had kids, and his wife worked in D.C. at the time, so he was in a little different position than you're in.
Understood. Did you find yourself, Mr. Speaker, giving that advice to others?
Oh, there's a lot of people I've given this advice to. Some members I've told them it was time to leave. A few of those along the way. But I've given a lot of advice to members, staff, and like I said, a few journalists.
I want to ask one thing, though, on that front, because one of the things that I found so powerful is you gave me that advice, and then later on that year, you basically take it yourself, because we remember you got the Holy Father to come address Congress. And that was the pinnacle of your career, and you announced that you were stepping away the next day.
Well, I was going to leave at the end of 2014, but my number 2 guy, Eric Cantor, lost his primary in July of 2014.
Yeah.
And I just didn't think I could leave because I didn't think at the time that Kevin McCarthy was ready to be Speaker because he was the number 3 guy. And so I said, all right, I'll stick around through 2015. And so I knew at the end of 2015 I was going to leave. I was going to announce it on my birthday, November 17th. And after trying to get the Pope to come and address a joint session of Congress and worked at it for 20 years, it finally happened on September 24th. And after he left and all of our guests left, there were all these phone calls kept coming in from the House members, Senate members, Democrats, Republicans, staff. I finally realized the happiest day I had spent the 25 years I was there. And I thought, walking out the door to go have dinner with a bunch of my constituents, and I said to my chief of staff, Mike Summers, I said, hey, Summers, I might just make this announcement tomorrow. He said, well, why not? So I thought about it, and the next morning, I walked up to Starbucks and back with my boys, had my coffee and thought about it. Walked up to Pete's Diner and had breakfast and thinking about it. And I was walking on 2nd Street right past St. Peter's Church. There's a grotto there with a statue of the Virgin Mary. And I'll never forget glancing over at the grotto. And I thought, yep, today's the day. Yeah. And so Summers called me about a minute later and said, well, what do you think? I said, well, today's the day. And he said, well, you better get busy because we got a senior staff meeting at 8:45, and you probably ought to talk to them first.
Probably want to let them know, yeah.
And that was the happiest day of my career covering Congress, so I can understand why. You're never going to top that. Yeah. It was great.
So, Mr. Speaker, I know when you were Speaker, you kept a poem on your desk, a poem written by your father, Earl Boehner.
Yeah.
Called To Every Daddy. With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to read the last stanza. You're the little fellow's idol. You're the wisest of the wise. In his little mind about you, no suspicions ever rise. He believes in you devoutly, holds that all you say and do, he will say and do in your way when he's grown up to be like you. You are setting an example every day in all you do for the little boy who's waiting to grow up to be like you. Published December 18th, 1966.
You're making me cry. I can't imagine what's going on over there.
That's a hell of a poem, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, it is. Sure is.
And you mentioned that you gave advice to sons that you encountered on Capitol Hill. That poem had to be through your mind when you were doing just that.
Well, I never thought about the poem in that context before, but I got advice along the way, even when I didn't want it, like Luke. All right. But nobody travels the pathway of life by themselves. And you run into people, you meet people, and you learn from them.
And you learned a lot along the way.
So we're going to take a quick break, Mr.
Imparted it.
Speaker, and we'll be back in just one moment. I'm Major Garrett, Luke Russert, and Speaker John Boehner. Back in a minute.
I think it's time for the Republican Party to move on. And frankly, I think it's time for Donald Trump to move on.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back to The Takeout. Yes, Luke Russert is here for every single segment, but we are holding over the former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, for one last segment, segment 4. Mr. Speaker, when you look at life in Washington, when you were there, now that you see it from a distance, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm pretty happy that I'm retired. DC was getting a little crazy when I left, but boy, it's gotten a lot crazier since. And I get back to town, I don't probably 7-8 times a year, but I try to avoid Capitol Hill.
Mm-hmm. What is at work in American politics that disturbs you most?
Well, I think the polarization of America has resulted in the polarization of the Congress. And this polarization is fed every day by what we see on cable news, what we see on these social media platforms. It's pushing and pulling people into one of two camps, leaving fewer and fewer people in the middle. And this polarization has gotten to the point where, it's nasty. And you got friends you can't even talk to about it. Well, I don't want to talk to anybody about it. People come up to me and want to talk about this issue or that issue. Some lady getting on an airplane over the weekend said, well, are you for Mr. Trump this year or next year? I said, we'll see. And then she went on to ask another question about the Congress. And I thought, I'm a little suspicious of this person because I don't think we're going to agree on much of anything. I think she was a right-wing nutcase.
So where are you
anyway,
on the idea of Mr. Trump for next year?
I think it's time for the Republican Party to move on. And frankly, I think it's time for Donald Trump to move on.
Well, do you think either of those two things are going to happen?
Hope springs eternal.
So let me ask you this, getting back to Luke, Mr. Speaker, you gave that advice to more than one person. It takes a certain amount of bravery to take that advice, doesn't it?
It sure does, especially coming from me.
Any advice you'd want to impart to Luke now that he's on the other side of that journey?
Well, I read Luke's book, and I haven't texted him yet, but I'm about to say it's time to have dinner again and have the next conversation.
Well,
because the question is, what now, brother? What now?
we have to go to Alberto's right around the corner. We could,
Yes.
we could do another episode of this show.
We
could do
that. We've done the show from Alberto's, yes.
Yeah, but one of the things that was so nice about Speaker Boehner is that he has a certain genuine kindness about him that even his biggest opponents will admit is there, and even any journalist will admit is there. And I think one of the things that's so important is, it's similar to my father, that civility breeds trust. And when you can operate in that space, things become easier to understand and easier to get done, and everyone's the better off for it. So if there's ever an ability to get back into that space, that's something I'd like to be a part of.
And is there something, Luke, at this moment you'd like to tell Speaker Boehner about that advice that he gave you and how you've processed it?
Well, thank you so much, sir. I appreciate it. And it's been deeply meaningful to be being able to keep our friendship going on all these years. And, give me the advice about how to enjoy Merlot and cigarettes and to live and look as strong as you. And I'd like to know that.
Cabernet these days.
Cabernet, that's it, the healthy stuff. But in all seriousness, thank you so much, because those were thoughts that had been swimming around in my own mind, and that was the catalyst that said, hey, you know what? It's not the wrong decision to actually even think about these types of things.
Mr. Speaker, Luke,
Well-
thinking back on that, did you sense that Luke was thinking these things? Did you think
No,
you were
no.
getting there at an opportune moment?
No, I had no idea. All I knew was that he was a good guy, and it was time for him to kind of take a break, figure out who he was and where he was and what he wanted to do with the rest of his life.
And
Anyway, I'm proud of him. I'm proud of him.
Thank you, sir.
And do you think that there is something about the grind of politics that either requires people to ignore questions like that or forces them to ignore questions like that?
Oh, I don't know if it's got anything to do with politics. Just got to do with life.
Meaning you could be distracted as a lawyer, a banker, or anything else.
That can happen to anybody. I had opportunities that came along in life, and on top of that, I don't think I ever had a job when I wasn't thinking about what I was going to do next. And that over the years always helped me, because I always kept my eyes open for opportunities that you just never know when they're going to come along.
And when you told that to Luke, you didn't think he was lost, but you think he could. You thought what? Not that he was lost.
He wasn't lost. I just thought that he was a talented young man, and he had a big future and could do a lot with it. And somebody had to push him off this lazy spot that he was on.
Is he right about that? That a certain, if not intentional laziness, a kind of super comfortability had crept in?
It's not an easy job covering the Hill.
No.
So it's not laziness in the sense of, okay.
Physicality.
Yeah, right. The poor reporters who are working now just worked Memorial Day weekend, covering this debt limit struggle and have not had a day off in a month. So that's
what August is for.
Yeah, right. It used to be before damn social media. But I do think that what he warned is that you can really easily fall into this trap of a cycle where there's the consistent banquet circuit, there's constant changeover, and things become you get the new flashy object and you chase that, and then you just sort of settle into this unchallenged way of life, or this way of life where you don't question anything and you sort of assume this is the way it's always going to be. I've been fascinated because I think in the last few years you've seen some politicians come into Washington with almost this anthropological look at the place. And that's what he was doing with me in a bit. Sort of, okay, go up at 35,000 feet and actually think about this on the day-to-day and what it's like, which is incredibly meaningful coming from someone who's second in line to the presidency and at the top tier.
Mm-hmm. Were you an anthropologist in that moment, Speaker Boehner?
No, I was going to ask what the hell that word meant. Jeez.
Yes, House anthropologist and Speaker John Boehner. No, really, fill in the blank, Mr. Speaker. Go ahead.
Well, no. Listen, I told you, I thought Luke was a talented young man. He was doing a good job, but he could do it in his sleep. And not that he was sleeping a whole lot, but it was just time for him to look for the next big challenge in life, something bigger than what he was doing, because he's got more talent that was sitting on the sidelines and he was actually using.
And when this dinner convenes here in D.C. to have the conversation about the next act, I'll be your waiter or busboy or whatever. Yeah,
you'll be there.
We'll be there. We'll carry this on. Mr. Speaker,
you are more than welcome to join us. All right. You don't have to be on the outside.
And what's the Boehner special at Alberto's?
Oh, Wiener Schnitzel.
Yeah.
Well, it's not on the menu. It's
of course
veal
it's not
a la
on the menu.
Boehner.
Yes.
Veal a la Boehner, which is on the menu. Actually, it's Wiener Schnitzel a la Holstein, but the Italians do it better than the Germans.
Of course.
It's a veal Milanese, couple of eggs over easy, 8 or 10 anchovy fillets. It's great for you.
Yeah, and you'll have it all by
very
yourself,
good.
Mr. Speaker. I guarantee you that. That's about going to do me in. Mr. Speaker, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, sir, for joining us for this conversation with Luke Russert. We will see you around town and around the country.
Major, nice to be with you. And Luke, stay at it.
We'll be in
You got
touch. Thank you, sir.
More decisions to make.
Indeed.
Indeed. Stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial when we come back. See you.
so one of the things that especially is hard for men is that a lot of times men process emotion through alcohol, I've noticed at least.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. I'm Major Garrett. We're at the Tune In. Luke Russert is our guest. Look for Me There is his book, Grieving My Father, Finding Myself. This comes up with some frequency in the book, so I want to ask you about it. What's your relationship to alcohol?
My relationship to alcohol? That's a really good question. I grew up in a German, Irish, Italian family. So there's, my mom would have wine at dinner. My father would drink beers. But we've always observed a very sort of strict etiquette in the sense of if there's something important the next day, you must honor your commitments, as I have a Guinness here on your show, right?
Right.
But I do think that one of the things I learned, especially traveling, is I had set these limits for myself for quite a long time, which was, I wouldn't drink on Sundays ahead of the week. I would just, wouldn't drink and maybe have a happy hour on Thursday. And, occasionally things would change on the hill. And you enjoy yourself on the weekend, but always sort of try and keep it in the fairway. And when you travel, you go, oh, I'm going to be like the Italians, and I'm going to have my wine at lunch, or I'm going to be like certain countries in Latin America where men just sort of drink beer habitually like all day. And you learn a lot about yourself and how you react to it. But
Your tolerances
and
keeping
what's
your wits
good,
about
and
you.
Keeping your wits about you. But ultimately, what I came to realize is that moderation is key. That you can easily fall into a dark place if you use alcohol as a crutch. And I think one of the things that especially is hard for men is that a lot of times men process emotion through alcohol, I've noticed at least. And one of the things as it pertains to grief is that alcohol can be a very good friend when you're in some dark places with grief, but it can be a huge adversary. I was thankful that one of the advantages of having such a demanding job as a young man was I avoided those pitfalls, not necessarily because I didn't want them, but because any hangover on a Monday morning was significantly worse than any of the enjoyment I would have had. Because when you're on television...
And it carried consequences.
It carries consequences from the viewers and from your bosses, but also when you're on television and you're not feeling well, whether it's you're hungover...
Can't hide it.
Hungover, but even if you have like an allergy or a cold or sore throat, you really do look miserable.
Picks up on everything.
I remember there was one time when I was on air and I was very sick, and it was just a sort of head cold, and I remembered, oh gosh, like I just look gray, right? And you don't want that. And some people, they forcibly do that to themselves, which is hard.
In the book, you go to lots of beautiful places where there are big spaces around you, and you talk with some frequency in the book about feelings of aloneness. Did you ever, in those big spaces, maybe at night or maybe first thing in the morning, let out one hellacious scream?
Yeah, but it wasn't in those spaces. It was more driving in a car, things like that.
Because?
I think that sometimes your emotions are bottled up and you may have difficulty processing them. And a natural thing to do is to just let out and hit the dashboard. And I'm not an angry person at all. I'm rather much a pacifist, especially these days. My friends from high school say I've gotten quite soft, almost in a yoga space, if you will. But I do think there are a lot of moments where when things are confusing, and especially where I was in a lot of 2018, just sort of not knowing what was ahead and sort of feeling my way, you do become overpowered by anger. You can be overpowered by fear. You can be overpowered by anguish. And sometimes the reaction to that is to scream and just sort of let out, ah! And so I did that, and it's beneficial. And it's funny, I had a school nurse when I remember this distinctly, I would be like 8 or 9, and she would encourage us to scream into a pillow if we were little kids. Sort of have a temper tantrum. Go have a temper tantrum into your pillow. And I never understood the merits of that until I was in my 30s. But it works.
So complete this sentence for me.
Yeah.
Because I travel the world, I
am a much more fulfilled and happy person, which is first and foremost, I think, just the gift of travel more so than anything else. But I'm significantly more comfortable in the uncertainty that is life. And one of the things that the Buddhists preach is that life is suffering, and you have to live inside that suffering. And once you're at peace with that and you understand that, you're capable of many things, and you'll ultimately be at peace yourself. I took learning that in Cambodia and crossed it over to something I learned from the Jesuits, which is the Examen, which is a sort of daily meditative exercise to what did you learn today, where were you your best self, where were you your worst self, and how do you carry that through to the next day. And I think for me that all comes from travel. Like I'm in a much more comfortable place than I was 6-7 years ago. And I have the journey to thank for that.
Are you more or less Catholic?
Ooh, probably more. And I say that because one of the interesting things about traveling and the exposure to different faiths is you really realize that we're all going to the same place. We just take different roads to get there. The Catholic Church, for all its problems, it always offered a path for me in my journeys and my times. I never left prayer or a service feeling worse than I did going in. I always sort of felt better. I don't think it's, one of the beautiful things about traveling is you become amenable to everything. I had firsthand experience going to mosques, going to synagogues, going to temples, and really tried to learn about all these different religions and different things. So I don't think there's any premium. No one has it completely right. It just is the one I was born into and I've understood and that I'm comfortable with.
We have 3 questions we pose to every guest here. Take them in whichever order you prefer. Most influential book in your life and why? Favorite movie and all kind of music that you enjoy most, genre or artist?
Oh, wow. All right, so the easy answer for the most influential book in my life would be Big Russ and Me, written by my father. That's just because getting to hear his story to this day through audible recordings has been greatly beneficial to me. His voice is still alive, so I'm so thankful for that. If we go outside of that and we apply it into all books, the book that sort of served for me early on in life is a book by the late, great Tony Horowitz. It was called Confederates in the Attic. And in that book, Horowitz basically tries to travel around and understand the American South and understand the divisions between different regions of the country and seeks to understand why are things the way they are. And I read that book as a young man in my teens, and it had a profound effect on me because it taught me the value of real world experience and immersing yourself in immersion, the value of immersion. And as a history major, I love primary source documents, and that's part of the reason why I like Capitol Hill so much is that every day is a primary source document. So Confederates in the Attic by Tony Horowitz.
Movie?
Well, my father's favorite movie was Cool Hand Luke, and that's one of the Lukes that I'm named after. But that's not my favorite movie. I would say my favorite movie, the one that was the most impactful on me growing up, I'm going to have to answer 2. One was the movie Rudy, which I loved because of the scrappy underdog nature of it, and it was in a movie that tugged on the heartstrings, and I watched it with my father, and so I really enjoyed that. The other one that I come back to consistently that I really don't turn away when I watch it is a very dark one, and that's American History X, that Norton. And I go back to that film and when it was made, and people thought it was a very radical film when it came out, and sadly it's proven very prescient. And I encourage people to watch it. It's very dark. It's very hard.
Very dark.
But it's something that I watched it for the first time. I had a teacher that got permission that I think we saw it when I was 14 or 15 years old.
Yeah.
And I've never forgotten it. And it certainly made a huge impact on my life and how I sort of
deeply
see
heavy,
things.
prescient, and dark as all get out. Your kind of music that you enjoy most?
I inherited a love of Springsteen from my father, and he's still my favorite. I like all types of music. Like I've been on this recent Tina Turner kick since she passed. Got a lot of her. My mom did 2 articles about her, which was fascinating. But I really like Jason Isbell recently. He's a country singer. I think he's the best songwriter of his generation. We're kind of close in age, and I've gotten deep into the catalog with him. And when I was writing the book, he has a song called "Hope the High Road," and I used to listen to it every single morning when I would make my eggs and coffee in San Francisco before I would write. So 5 days a week, I would listen to that song. It was sort of my walk-up song.
And the walk-up song for the book he was writing is the book entitled "Look for Me There: Grieving My Father, Finding Myself." Luke Russert has been our guest here at the Tune In. Luke, thanks.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week, folks.